After Paulina Longworth Sturm died in January 1957, her mother Alice Roosevelt Longworth did something that alarmed the people who knew her well. She removed every photograph of Paulina from the house. Every one. The pictures that had hung in the picture-filled rooms of the DuPont Circle home. The photographs of Paulina as a child, as a young woman, as a mother. Gone. And then Alice told those around her that Paulina's name was not to be mentioned. No one was to bring it up. No one was to refer to the daughter she had just buried. Washington paid attention to this, because they had seen it before. Not in Alice. In Alice's father. When Theodore Roosevelt's first wife died in 1884, 2 days after giving birth to Alice, he drew a black X over the date in his diary and wrote 5 words, "The light has gone out of my life." Then he left. And he never spoke his first wife's name again. He removed her from his autobiography. He forbade her to be mentioned in his presence. Alice grew up in a household where the most important woman in her own history, the woman whose name she carried, could not be acknowledged. And then Alice Roosevelt Longworth grew up, and had a daughter named Paulina, and for 31 years did not know how to love her. And when Paulina died, Alice responded to that grief the exact same way her father had responded to his. She erased the evidence. The names changed. The pattern did not. This is the story of Paulina Longworth Sturm, the only daughter of Alice Roosevelt, the granddaughter of a president, a woman who spent her entire life trying to survive the inheritance her family had given her, and who died at 31 with a daughter of her own who needed someone to protect her. And the person Paulina left that daughter to was Alice. You need to understand one day before you can understand anything else. February 14, 1884. Theodore Roosevelt was 25 years old, serving in the New York State Legislature in Albany, when a telegram reached him. His wife Alice had given birth to a daughter 2 days earlier. Mother and infant had seemed well, but something had changed overnight. He needed to come home immediately. He arrived at the family townhouse at 6 West 57th Street in Manhattan to find 2 women dying simultaneously in 2 separate rooms. His mother, Martha Mitty Bullock Roosevelt, had succumbed to typhoid fever in the early morning, aged 48. She had been ill for days, but the family had not understood how serious it was. In the afternoon of the same day, in that same house, his wife, Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt, 22 years old, died of Bright's disease, a kidney condition that had gone undetected throughout her pregnancy. Theodore Roosevelt opened his diary that night and drew a large black X over February 14. Below the X, he wrote, "The light has gone out of my life." He did not write his wife's name again in any public document. He refused to allow her to be mentioned in his presence. He later published his autobiography and omitted her entirely, as if the woman he had described as his darling little sunshine had never existed. In the words of one account, he failed ever to mention her even to her own daughter. One family member later described his reasoning this way. He believed that his decision to remarry in 1886 was a sign of inconstancy, that remarriage was a kind of moral failure, and that the daughter who bore his first wife's name was a living reminder of both the woman he could never discuss and the love he felt he had betrayed. Alice herself wrote of it much later, "My father obviously didn't want the symbol of his infidelity around. It was all so dreadfully Victorian and mixed up. He left. He gave baby Alice to his sister Anna, known as Bamie, and went west to the Dakota Territory to live as a rancher for 2 years. His daughter was an infant. He did not take her with him." When Theodore Roosevelt returned and eventually remarried Edith Kermit Caro in 1886, Alice was brought into the household. Edith insisted on being called mother. She gave Theodore 5 more children in rapid succession. And Alice, who had confided to her diary that her father didn't care for her 1/8 as much as he does for the other children, grew up knowing that she was an outsider in her own father's house. Present but not central, noticed but not quite claimed. This is where Alice Roosevelt learned what love looked like. what grief looked like, what you did with the things that could destroy you if you let them show. You removed the photographs. You forbade the name. You kept moving. Alice Roosevelt Longworth married Nicholas Longworth of Ohio at the White House on February 17, 1906. The wedding was the social event of the decade. More than 1,000 guests inside, thousands more gathered on the street. The Washington Times reporting it felt like celebrating a national holiday. Alice wore cream satin and cut the wedding cake with a borrowed military sword. The marriage was, by most accounts, structurally arranged rather than deeply felt. Nicholas Longworth was 14 years older than Alice, a Harvard-educated Republican congressman from Cincinnati, charming and sociable, an accomplished violinist. He was also, as Alice herself noted with characteristic candor, someone who would rather be tight than president. His alcoholism was well documented. His infidelities were equally well documented. Both of them conducted affairs throughout the marriage, and both of them knew it, and Washington knew it, and no one printed it. By the 1920s, Nicholas Longworth had become Speaker of the House, one of the most powerful positions in the federal government. And Alice's DuPont Circle home had become something Washington had never quite seen, a private salon that functioned as a political instrument. For 6 decades she gathered senators, cabinet officials, foreign diplomats, presidential candidates, and the specific class of insider whose value lay in what they knew and chose not to say publicly. She shaped narratives. She moved outcomes. Richard Nixon said she was the most interesting conversationalist of the age. Presidents sought her approval. Journalists angled for invitations. This was the household into which Paulina Longworth arrived on February 14, 1925. Valentine's Day, the anniversary of the deaths of her maternal grandmother and great-grandmother, which was an accident of biology, but a fact that would have been noted in a family that tracked such things. Her mother was 41 years old and had been married for nearly 20 years. Paulina's biological father was not Nicholas Longworth. Alice Roosevelt had already decided what to call the baby. Deborah. Not for any ancestral reason. For Senator William Edgar Borah of Idaho, the man most of Washington already suspected was the child's father, and the man Alice had been involved with for years in the most openly conducted secret affair in the capital. Deborah. A private joke encoded in a birth certificate. The kind of move that was so audacious it almost looped around to being brilliant. Nicholas Longworth would not agree to the name. He saw through it immediately. The child was named Paulina instead, pronounced Paulina, and Longworth accepted her publicly without qualification. The question of paternity is not, at this point, historically contested. When Alice's diaries were opened to researchers after her death, they confirmed what biographers Carol Felsenthal and Betty Boyd Caroli and Time journalist Rebecca Winters Keegan had all reported independently. William Borah of Idaho was Paulina's biological father. A family friend later noted that around Washington, everyone called the child Aurora Borah Alice. The joke ran so far and so openly that the only people maintaining the official fiction were the principals themselves. Borah was 59 years old when Paulina was born. He chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was one of the most formidable legislators of his era. He was also married to another woman and had no intention of changing any of that. He never acknowledged Paulina. In no letter, no record, no public or private gesture that has survived. Whatever arrangement existed between Borah and Alice was conducted entirely through absence, his name never attached to the child, his presence in her life exactly zero. Nicholas Longworth, by contrast, was devoted to her. He played with her. He noticed her. Every Saturday, records show, Paulina was taken to the Capitol to have lunch with her daddy, and this was their custom, documented and photographed. She was, as one contemporary noted, one of the most famous babies in the world in those early years. People photographed her constantly. Her father adored her. He died on April 9, 1931, of pneumonia, while visiting his friend Dwight Philly Davis in Aiken, South Carolina. He was 61 years old. Paulina was 6. President Herbert Hoover sent his condolences to Alice by telegram that same day. At a memorial service held at the Library of Congress the following month, Longworth's friends Ephraim Zimbalist and Harold Bauer played Brahms's D minor sonata. Alice brought her husband's body back to Cincinnati and interred it at Spring Grove Cemetery. Then she went home, and Paulina, who had adored him, was left alone in the house with Alice. To understand what Paulina grew up inside after Nicholas Longworth's death, you have to understand what Alice Roosevelt Longworth had already become by 1931. The wit was not decorative. It was power. Alice's quip about Thomas Dewey, that he looked like the bridegroom on a wedding cake, is credited in some accounts with dooming 2 consecutive presidential campaigns. Theodore Roosevelt had said he could either run the country or manage Alice, but not both. That observation remained accurate for decades. She moved political outcomes through conversation, through the people she gathered, through what she said and what she chose to withhold. A household organized around that power had no natural space for a quiet, stuttering 6-year-old girl. Historians agree that Paulina was ignored, stifled, and belittled by her overbearing mother, who desired for Paulina to become an extroverted society woman like herself. Alice demanded performance. She wanted a daughter who could hold a room. What she got was a girl who went silent when watched. The specific mechanism of damage is recorded. Alice's half-brother Kermit Roosevelt noted that Alice had a habit of finishing Paulina's sentences for her, stepping in before Paulina could complete a thought, supplying the words herself, eliminating the stutter by eliminating the speaker. And Kermit referred to Paulina, tongue-in-cheek, as being considered by Alice's sisters competition. One child in that house. Only one was allowed to hold the room. One account in American Heritage describes it plainly. In the home of Alice Roosevelt Longworth there was room for only one child. The clothes. This detail keeps surfacing in the historical record, always paired with Katharine Graham's observation. Alice demanded Paulina act like an extrovert and then dressed her in drab, homely clothes that undermined the performance before it could begin. Katharine Graham, who would go on to run the Washington Post and know everyone in Washington with the clarity that power brings, remembered Paulina as a rather sad girl, pale and not done up. One physical feature stood apart in every description: green eyes. Striking and unusually lovely. No surviving account records Alice ever commenting on them. Paulina developed what the record consistently calls a severe stutter. It worsened in Alice's presence. It eased when Alice was absent. The stutter did not originate in neurological disorder, it originated in a specific social environment, and it functioned as a precise record of what that environment required of the person inside it. Eleanor Roosevelt and Alice Longworth had been conducting a prolonged public antagonism for decades by the time Paulina was a child. Alice mocked Eleanor's politics, her appearance, her marriage, her causes, publicly, precisely, and with the kind of wit that made the mockery stick. Eleanor absorbed it and kept moving. And quietly, regularly, without announcement, Eleanor kept a seat at the table for Alice's daughter. Despite family tensions, Paulina was often invited to the White House by Eleanor Roosevelt to play with her cousins. Sisty and Buzzy Doll were near Paulina's age. Eleanor looked after Paulina at the White House when Alice was out of town. She included Paulina in dinner invitations. Eleanor Roosevelt had been an awkward, lonely girl herself. She had written about it, spoken about it, never pretended otherwise. She recognized in Paulina the specific loneliness of a child who existed in the shadow of a dazzling parent and was not seen. On the rare occasions she felt safe and secure, Paulina briefly blossomed. There was the time late one night at boarding school when, dressed in pajamas, the teenager reenacted her grandfather's famous charge up San Juan Hill, to the hilarious laughter of her doormates. Her grandfather's theatricality, his physical courage, his instinct for the room. It was in her, available under the right conditions. It came out when the audience was doormates in pajamas at midnight, when no one who mattered for the performance of Alice Roosevelt Longworth's household was watching. There is a version of Paulina Longworth in that boarding school dormitory that never got to fully exist. Eleanor could not fix what was happening in Alice's house. She could not restructure it or remove Paulina from it or make Alice into something she wasn't. What she could do was leave a light on. And she did. Every Saturday that Paulina came to the White House, every dinner invitation, every arrangement made while Alice was out of town, each one a small act of counter-testimony to what Alice's household was telling Paulina she was worth. The contrast between what Eleanor did for Paulina and what the rest of Washington did tells you something about Paulina's position in that world. She was photographed constantly as a baby, one of the most famous babies in the world, one account noted, because she was the speaker's daughter and the granddaughter of Theodore Roosevelt and the daughter of Alice. Everyone knew her name. Everyone had an opinion about who had actually fathered her. No one, in the social world that surrounded her childhood, appeared to have wondered what the experience was like from inside it. Washington is a city that performs attention. It knows how to look at people of consequence. What it does less well is notice the ones who are present by proximity rather than by power. The children of the powerful, the quieter wives, the ones who did not inherit the gift for filling a room. Paulina Longworth was visible in that city from the moment she was born. She was photographed, documented, included in newspaper stories. And she was, by every account, profoundly unseen. Eleanor Roosevelt saw her. That is the thing the historical record preserves. In a city organized around attention as currency, Eleanor spent that currency on Paulina Longworth when no one was counting on her to do so. Paulina enrolled at Vassar College. 1 year. After 1 year, the pressure of college life proved too much and she returned to living with her mother. The stutter came back with her. That sequence, distance, relative stability, return, collapse, is the pattern the historical record documents every time Paulina attempted to build her own life. The body kept the evidence. Whatever version of herself she managed to construct at a distance from Alice's household dissolved on contact with it, reliably, each time. What pressure meant specifically at Vassar, whether academic, social, financial, or something more internal, the record does not specify. What the record shows is the outcome. She went home. Back to DuPont Circle. Back to the dinners where Alice performed and Paulina sat with the wrong clothes and the green eyes that no one looked at twice. She was in her early 20s. Her biological father had never claimed her. The man who had raised her was dead. Her mother ran one of the most socially intimidating households in America. The record does not reveal where else she might have gone or whether she had anywhere to go. In 1944, Alice Roosevelt Longworth was campaigning against President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, her distant cousin, the man whose New Deal she had publicly despised and opposed for over a decade. She brought Paulina along. And somewhere in the course of that campaign, Paulina met Alexander McCormick Sturm. Sandy, 21 years old, a Yale graduate from a prominent family, an artist and writer who would later co-found the firearms manufacturer Sturm, Ruger & Co. He was also, by every account in the historical record, someone who could stand up to Alice Longworth and did. From a wealthy, socially prominent family himself, Alexander had no problem standing up to Alice and became the fragile Paulina's protector. Protector, not companion. Not husband, the word the historical record uses for Sandy Sturm repeatedly across independent sources. The implication is clear: Paulina needed protecting. That protection had not previously existed in her life. Sandy Sturm provided it. They married on August 26, 1944, when Paulina was 19 years old. Alice Longworth desired for Paulina to complete her college education before marrying, something she herself had never managed. The concern was real. The delivery was characteristic, framed as objection to the marriage rather than as care for the daughter. Paulina's marriage to Sturm further strained the mother-daughter relationship, a clause that suggests there was a relationship left to strain. The Sturms moved to Westport, Connecticut, to property near Sandy's parents. In July 1946, Paulina gave birth to Joanna Mercedes Alessandra Sturm. By most accounts, Paulina, unlike her own mother, was a doting and attentive mother to Joanna, and the two were very close. She turned it around in one generation. Every form of warmth Alice had not given her, the daily presence, the attentiveness, the sense that the child was the most important thing in the room, Paulina gave to Joanna. Without instruction, without a model, she looked at what had been done to her and chose deliberately to do otherwise. This is the most significant documented fact about Paulina Longworth's character as an adult, and it is almost never the sentence that leads the story. She was also, for these years, in Connecticut, married to a man who loved her and protected her from the pressure that had always undone her. She was present. She was warm. She was, by every surviving account, something close to happy. Then November 1951. Alexander Sturm was 28 years old when he was hospitalized with viral hepatitis. He died 10 days later, on November 13, 1951. Joanna was 5 years old. Losing her husband and protector plunged Paulina deeper into depression and dependency on alcohol and sleeping pills. What followed is documented in clinical terms that do not fully carry the weight of what they describe. In her adult years, Paulina suffered from depression and alcoholism, and endured institutionalizations and shock therapy treatments following several suicide attempts. Institutionalizations, plural, extended periods in psychiatric facilities. Joanna, who was 5 at the start of this and moving toward 7 and then 8, navigating those absences with whatever adults remained present in her life. Consider the specific arithmetic of Paulina's losses. She lost the father who raised her, Nicholas Longworth, the man who had taken her to the Capitol every Saturday, at age 6. She had, before Sandy Sturm, never had a consistent adult presence in her life who simply showed up and stayed. Sandy provided that for 7 years. He stood between Paulina and Alice. He was the reason she could exist in a household of her own, on her own terms, being the mother she had not had. He was, in the plainest reading of the evidence, the first person outside of Eleanor Roosevelt who had looked at Paulina Longworth and seen someone worth protecting. And then he was gone at 28. Viral hepatitis. 10 days in hospital. Paulina was widowed at 26 with a 5-year-old daughter and no buffer left between herself and a past she had not finished with. The depression that followed was not a new condition. The historical record strongly implies she had been managing depression for years before Sandy's death, that the stability of their marriage in Connecticut had been holding it at a manageable distance. Sandy's death did not cause the depression. It removed the only structure that had been containing it. The shock therapy was early 1950s medicine, electroconvulsive therapy administered without the anesthesia and muscle relaxants that later became standard. Patients emerged disoriented with memory loss that could last months. It was the established intervention for severe depression in that era. It was painful, disorienting, and it was what the psychiatric establishment offered a 26-year-old widow who was drowning. There is no surviving record of Alice visiting Paulina during any of these hospitalizations. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who could telephone sitting presidents, who could arrange retraction of newspaper stories, who had been the most socially connected woman in Washington for 30 years, does not appear in the record as present during her daughter's worst period. Whether she was present and the record does not capture it, or whether she was genuinely absent, is not something the available evidence settles. What the available evidence does not show is Alice's presence. That absence, in a record this thoroughly documented, is itself a form of evidence. What Paulina did next, in the middle of all of this, is the part of the story that changes how you understand her. In 1952, Paulina Longworth Sturm, granddaughter of a president, daughter of the most powerful private woman in Washington, 26-year-old widow undergoing psychiatric treatment, walked into Dorothy Day's Catholic Worker Hospitality House on Christie Street on New York's Lower East Side and began volunteering. Dorothy Day was a radical Catholic pacifist who had spent decades under FBI surveillance. The Catholic worker movement she founded was not fashionable charity. These were houses of hospitality for the poor, the homeless, the addicted, people the rest of Washington's social world did not encounter. The work required you to show up every day, put on an apron, and be present with people who had nothing. The movement had no interest in performance, no interest in maintaining appearances. It demanded exactly what Alice Roosevelt Longworth's household had always refused to value: the willingness to be in a room where you were not the most impressive person present. Paulina showed up, and she kept showing up. She also volunteered at several Washington, D.C. hospitals, and she converted to Catholicism. When Paulina formally converted to Roman Catholicism in 1953, Joanna converted with her, mother and daughter together in that faith in that year. The Catholic worker tradition gave Paulina something she had never had growing up: a framework that did not require performance. Dorothy Day's houses operated on the premise that the works of mercy were not supplemental to Christian life, they were the center of it. You served because it was required of you, not because it reflected well on you. You showed up in rooms that were unglamorous and stayed. Paulina stayed. She was also, in this period, trying to hold herself together. The previous suicide attempts were in the record. The dependency on alcohol and sleeping pills had not resolved. But she maintained her practice, she raised Joanna, she volunteered, and she observed the faith she had chosen, including, and this becomes relevant later, the Catholic teaching on the sanctity of life. This is the woman who died on January 27, 1957. The autopsy on Paulina Longworth Sturm noted her cause of death as accidental, an overdose of sleeping pills, combined with alcohol dependency, producing a lethal interaction. She was 31 years old and died less than 3 weeks before her 32nd birthday. The Washington Post reported it as a suicide. Alice Roosevelt Longworth called. The Post printed a retraction. The record was adjusted. Alice's argument was theological and institutional. Paulina had been an observant Catholic. The Catholic Church at that time explicitly forbade suicide, and the Church had permitted a Catholic burial, which under canon law would not have been extended to a confirmed suicide. Alice maintained that the death was accidental, that it was the outcome of a long pattern of alcohol and sleeping pill dependency, not a deliberate act. The retraction the Post printed does not answer the question. It tells you what Alice could arrange. Though she had attempted suicide before, her mother did not agree with the suicide view. The historical record holds both possibilities without resolving them. What it does not hold is any evidence that the question was ever straightforwardly settled. Vice President Richard Nixon served as a pallbearer at Paulina's funeral. Alice had developed a genuine friendship with Nixon during his time as vice president. The pallbearer role was a gesture toward the Longworth family's Washington standing and toward Alice personally. The Vice President of the United States carried the casket of a 31-year-old woman who had spent her final years feeding strangers on the Lower East Side. If you are finding this story moving, the invisible daughters of famous women, the costs that never appear in the newspaper, this is what the Giggled Women was built to document. Subscribe, share this with someone who loves real history, and leave a comment below. We read every one. Paulina Longworth Sturm was buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C. After Paulina died, Alice Roosevelt Longworth removed every photograph of her daughter from the house. She told those around her that Paulina's name was not to be mentioned. A friend who knew Alice well was quoted in American Heritage. After the death, Alice kept saying, over and over, I wonder, is it all my fault? The question was real. It was asked aloud. But it was asked inside a household where the answer could not be examined too closely, because examining it would have required looking at 50 years of how a family transmitted grief across generations. No pictures. No name. Exactly what Theodore Roosevelt had done to Alice's own dead mother. The pattern completed itself. And then Alice Roosevelt Longworth, at 73, went to court to get custody of Joanna. Not very long before Paulina's death, Paulina and Alice had discussed the care of Joanna in case of such an event. They had that conversation, it is documented. Whatever the state of the relationship between mother and daughter in those final months, they sat together and planned for Joanna's future. In Paulina's will, her mother Alice Roosevelt Longworth was left custody of Joanna. Paulina chose Alice. You can interpret that choice many ways. Perhaps she had no one she trusted more. Perhaps she had seen something change in her mother, some acknowledgement, some softening, that the record does not fully capture. Perhaps it was the most practical option available to a woman who knew she was running out of time. But Paulina chose Alice. And Alice fought for it in court and won. Joanna was 10 years old when she went to live with her grandmother. She stayed for 25 years. In contrast to Alice's relationship with her daughter, she doted on her granddaughter, and the two were very close. In an article in American Heritage in 1969, Joanna, then 22, was described as a highly attractive and intellectual young woman and called a notable contributor to Mrs. Longworth's youthfulness. The bonds between them are described as twin cables of devotion and a healthy respect for each other's tongue. One friend observed, Mrs. L has been a wonderful father and mother to Joanna, mostly father. Mostly father. The person who said this knew exactly what they were saying. Alice had never fully learned to be a mother. With Joanna she learned something else, or something closer to enough, and the record is consistent that what existed between them was real. Joanna told CBS News, decades later, she had many characteristics that are gone forever. Nobody had the same accent. Nobody knows poetry anymore. After Paulina's death, Alice honored Paulina's request that Joanna receive a Catholic education and enrolled her at Stone Ridge, the Sacred Heart Day School in Bethesda, Maryland. Joanna graduated in 1963. She then attended Georgetown University. Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who had buried a voodoo doll of Nellie Taft in the White House lawn, who had carried a green garter snake to state functions, who had spent 6 decades as the sharpest wit in any room she entered, drove her granddaughter to a Catholic school she did not attend herself, honored a faith she had not converted to, and kept the promise she had made to a daughter whose name she could not say. Every day, every year, she did it. Whether that was love, or guilt, or the specific form of love that guilt teaches you when everything else has failed, the record does not say. What the record shows are the actions. The Catholic school, the Georgetown enrollment, the 25 years of a granddaughter living in that house, the close relationship that Joanna Sturm has described, in her own words, as the defining relationship of her life. The woman who had been the worst possible mother somehow managed, with the same child's child, to become someone Joanna chose to stay near for 25 years. Upon Paulina's death, Eleanor Roosevelt sent her condolences to Alice. The two women mended their broken relationship. This fact appears in multiple sources and is recorded without elaboration in most of them, which means it is usually treated as a footnote. It should not be. Eleanor Roosevelt and Alice Longworth had been in public conflict for decades. Alice mocked Eleanor constantly and without mercy. Eleanor absorbed it and kept moving. There was no reconciliation before Paulina's death that any public record confirms. And then Paulina died. And Eleanor wrote, the woman Alice had publicly humiliated across 30 years of Washington dinners and newspaper columns reached across all of it because a daughter was dead. Because Alice was a mother who had lost a child. Because Eleanor Roosevelt, who had spent her life seeing the people that powerful rooms chose not to see, understood something about Alice's grief that the rest of Washington's social commentary did not acknowledge. Alice received the letter, and the estrangement that had seemed permanent began to close. The child Eleanor had kept a chair for, back when Paulina was small and sad and pale and needed somewhere to go. That same child, in death, was the reason the two women finally stopped fighting. Paulina Longworth accomplished in dying something she had never managed in life. She made the two most powerful women in the Roosevelt family look at each other without the performance. There is a pattern running through this family that the historical record makes almost impossible to ignore once you see it. Alice Hathaway Lee Roosevelt died in 1884. 2 days after giving birth to her daughter. Theodore Roosevelt refused to speak her name, erased her from his autobiography, and left the infant who carried her name to be raised by others. Alice grew up without the right to mourn her own mother. She grew up in a house where grief was a private catastrophe that had to be managed into invisibility. Alice Roosevelt Longworth grew up into a woman who filled every room she entered and emptied it of air for anyone who couldn't match her. She had a daughter, Paulina. Paulina stuttered. Paulina went quiet. Paulina could not perform. And Alice, who had spent her entire childhood learning that the things you could not perform had to be hidden, did not know how to be with a child who simply could not hide well enough. She finished Paulina's sentences. She dressed her in the wrong clothes. She made her feel, in that specific Rooseveltian way, that who she actually was did not quite measure up to what the household required. And Paulina died at 31. And Alice removed the photographs and forbade the name. Exactly what Theodore had done. There is a parallel current running through this that the Roosevelt family's public legend tends to obscure. Alice was not the only Roosevelt child who could not sustain the performance. Her half-brother Kermit, who had accompanied Theodore on the 1909 African safari, who had saved his father's life in the Amazon jungle while exploring an uncharted river in Brazil, battled depression and alcoholism for much of his adult life. He died by suicide in 1943. The Roosevelt prescription for grief and pain was bury it, go west, don't speak the name. That prescription worked, after a fashion, for those who had the gift for forward motion. It did not work for Kermit. It did not work for Paulina. The family that produced extraordinary public figures also produced, in the generation that came of age after Theodore, a recurring private pattern of suffering that the newspapers did not report and the public record struggled to hold. Alice had grown up inside that system. She had learned its rules with exceptional precision. The performance of strength. The refusal to name what you could not control. The transformation of grief into wit, which was a way of keeping it moving so it could not settle. These were not character flaws she chose. They were survival adaptations she had needed and that had served her for 9 decades of a life spent in the most politically charged rooms in America. They were simply not survivable from the inside for Paulina. The pattern had crossed 3 generations before Joanna broke it. Joanna Sturm, who lost her father at 5 and her mother at 10, who went to live with a grandmother who had never successfully loved her own daughter, somehow grew into a woman who has spent her adult life preserving the record. Who sat with Alice for her 1969 and 1974 interviews with 60 Minutes. Who has been described by historians as one of the most valuable living sources on the Roosevelt family. Who has kept, in her Washington home, the memorabilia and furniture and a pillow that once belonged to Grammy. Joanna kept the photographs. Joanna said the names. What Paulina could not do for herself, Joanna did for all of them. Alice Roosevelt Longworth lived until February 20, 1980. She was 96 years old, the firstborn and the last to die of Theodore Roosevelt's children. In 1956, she was diagnosed with breast cancer and underwent a mastectomy. In 1970, cancer was found in the other breast. A second mastectomy followed. She kept hosting dinners. She kept taking calls. Nixon, after she encouraged him back into politics following his 1960 loss to Kennedy, invited her to his first formal White House dinner and to his daughter Tricia's wedding in 1971. Alice, at 87, went. Her health deteriorated in her final years, but the acuity did not. She remained, by the accounts of those who visited, precisely herself. The most interesting person in the room, the sharpest voice in any conversation, still able to dismantle an argument with a single sentence. She died at home, of emphysema and pneumonia, 8 days after her 96th birthday. Her house on Embassy Row, filled with photographs of presidents, filled with decades of Washington history, filled with the narwhal tusk Joanna later kept, did not, in those final years, contain photographs of Paulina. She was famous for her one-liners but spoke little of her personal trials. The diaries she kept across her long life, the ones open to historical researchers after her death, the ones that confirmed Bora's paternity, the ones that held whatever private account she maintained, are held in the Library of Congress. She had donated Theodore Roosevelt's 1884 diary to the library herself in 1960. The pocket diary with the black X. The light has gone out of my life. She donated her father's diary, but not her own account of her daughter. Whatever Alice Roosevelt Longworth thought about Paulina, about the 31 years, about the photographs she removed, about the question a friend remembered her asking over and over in those first days after Paulina's death, that record was sealed. And remains so. Paulina Longworth Sturm is buried in Rock Creek Cemetery in Washington, D.C. She entered the world on the day that had already claimed her grandmother and her great-grandmother. She was named after a compromise between a joke and a cover story. She grew up in a house where the most powerful presence was the one least likely to notice her. She found a man who loved her and buried him at 26. She walked into Dorothy Day's house on the Lower East Side and kept showing up. She raised a daughter who loved her completely. She was 31 years old. The last time Alice Roosevelt Longworth publicly spoke of Paulina, in any account, in any interview, was not recorded. What was recorded is the absence. The photographs removed. The name forbidden. And then, underneath all of it, the friend's account of Alice in those first days, she kept saying, I wonder, is it all my fault? She knew, at some level, in some register that her public self would never have permitted her to express, she knew. Whether knowing was the same as understanding, whether understanding was the same as being able to change, those are the questions the historical record cannot answer. What the record can say is this: Alice Roosevelt Longworth looked at what she had done to her daughter and asked the right question. She just asked it after Paulina was dead. There is a photograph of Alice on her 43rd birthday in 1927. Paulina is 2 years old. Alice is looking at the camera. Paulina is looking at her mother. It is one of the last photographs Alice kept.